Okay, we're continuing through the book of Genesis, as you know, and we're arrived now at the beginning of chapter 29. And they're going to look at this chapter, I would think it's going to take just two studies. We're going to be covering Genesis chapter 29 from verses 1 to 29. And I'm given the overall title of these two studies, What Goes Around Comes Around. Now, that's a familiar saying, isn't it? I'm sure you've heard it before. People say, what goes around comes around. Usually, when you hear people use it or quote it, they do so in a negative way, saying or implying something along the lines is that all the pain that someone's caused them will come back and hit them in the same way someday. But I wonder if you've ever heard that expression. Now, I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, have. But my question is that statement true? Is it true that what goes around comes around? Is there a payback time? That's the question we're going to ask this morning. Is it true in any case? Is it true in every case? Is it true some of the time? Or is it true all of the time? So what does the Bible say about the concept of what goes around comes around? Now, today we arrive in the story in the book of Genesis that I think answers that question to some degree. It's one of the most interesting stories in all of the book of Genesis, so join with me as we work together through Genesis chapter 29. Now again, this is a long passage of scripture, so rather than read it all at once, I'm going to do what I often do, which is go through it verse by verse over the next two episodes. So let's begin by reading the opening verses together. Genesis chapter 29, starting at verse 1. It says this: Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the open country with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to the place over the mouth of the well. So we'll just pause there for a moment, and I'd like to suggest that in order to understand this chapter, we really need to understand what has just happened in the previous chapter. Now that's okay if you've been with us on the journey and you've been there before, but verse 1, you see, is telling us that he continues on this journey to the land of the eastern people. So where is he going? Where has he come from? And why is he going where he's going to? Well, those answers to that question are found in the close of the previous chapter. Now, you might remember, especially if you've been following along, what happened in chapter 28. But let me just very quickly summarize for you by reminding you it all began with that Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, deceived his brother Esau. In those days, the oldest brother usually got the blessing from the father and the inheritance, but on this occasion, Jacob goes in and tricks his father, and he gets that blessing and that inheritance by deception. An inheritance, a blessing that his father had planned to give to his brother Esau. Now Esau finds out about this, and he's very angry, and he threatens to kill Jacob. And Jacob and his mother Rebekah then say the best option, she says to him, the best option is for you, Jacob, to get out of town. And that takes us to where we are now, chapter 29, verse 1. So Jacob is on this journey of escape. He's getting out of town, but and he's trying to get out quickly before his brother finds him and kills him. And he's on a journey, and he's heading towards the land that tells us of the people of the east. Now, at this point, we've just been given a very general statement about him heading east towards these people. Later in the passage, these people of the east will actually be identified as Nahor, the people of Nahor. And you might remember that Abraham's family was from there. A while back, when Abraham wanted a wife for his son, Jacob's father, Isaac, he sent his servant to Nahor to make that happen. So the fact that he's headed east here and headed to Nahor is very significant, I would suggest, in the overall context of the book of Genesis. So he's somewhere near Nahor, it's telling us, and the Bible then shows us here in verse 2 that he sees a well in a field, and he saw that there were flocks of sheep there around the well, and that they were coming there and gathering there to be watered, no doubt. Then it says something very interesting. It says in verse 3 that there is a stone over the well's mouth. Now this seems to me a little bit out of place in this narrative, but the author makes a particular point of noting the stone covering the well. So he's flagging something up for us that will come back again later. It doesn't have a great significance at this point, but it's going to play its part later. And we're told in these 3 verses that when the flocks gathered together in that area, then the shepherds would come and roll away the stone from the mouth of the well. And when they finished watering the sheep, they would roll the stone back again. So that's where we're up to, and that's the setting of the story so far. So Jacob stops at this well. Well, the narrative continues in verse 4, and it says, Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We are from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said. "And here comes his daughter, Rachel, with the sheep." So Jacob is clearly anticipating meeting his father's family, and which is why he asks them, "Do you know or know of Laban?" And these shepherds say, "Yes, we know him." And they say, "By the way, look, here comes Rachel. That's Laban's daughter. She actually looks after his sheep." The text continues, and he says this, "Look," he said, "the sun is high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them to pasture." "We can't," they replied, until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth. Then we will water the sheep." Now, I take it to be that the fact that it says all the flocks had to be gathered, that probably means the stone was too heavy to move by one individual. It's probably, they probably had reached some kind of agreement that they would only move the stone out of the way when all the flocks were gathered there. That, I believe, and other commentators suggest that's what's going on here. Anyway, the story continues in verse 9. While he was talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rebekah and began to weep aloud. Do you see here that 3 times he mentions the family relationship? This is his uncle, and he's making a big issue out of that. But he has now, in a sense, almost stumbled upon the family that it suggests he was looking for. In this case, he comes upon them by finding them at the well. Now, the text points out the fact that all of this area belongs to his uncle. But then it says Jacob kissed Rachel and raised up his voice and wept. What do you make of that, by the way? The Bible only very rarely says anything about a man kissing a woman, so this is a highly unusual statement, isn't it? He's just met her, so was this a romantic kiss, or was this more like a kiss on the cheeks, a greeting a bit more akin to something like a handshake? Now, personally, I'm slightly skeptical of love at first sight, but I'm certainly not skeptical of attraction at first sight. You've got, I believe, to really get to know a person before you can truly say that you love them. But many people testify to the fact that they said that when they met their marriage partner, that there was an immediate natural chemistry between them and their future wife or husband the minute they met. And of course, they did indeed get married. And that's indeed what I personally experienced. So perhaps something like this is happening here. Anyway, the text clearly says that he kissed her. The narrative continues in verse 12. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah. So she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood." And Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month. So Rachel gets excited and leaves the sheep and runs and tells her father that her nephew has shown up. Laban is the uncle and Jacob is the nephew, obviously. The passage is very clear about laying out the family relationships that are in this passage, and the fact that they also draws attention to the fact that they hadn't heard about each other, new details about each other's families and what they've been up to for quite a long time. So we see Jacob fills him in, and then they sort of catch up in family history, if you like. And Laban invites Jacob to stay with him. And then he says this. Laban said to him, "Just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." In other words, he's saying, I'd like you to continue staying with me for a month or so, and I'd like to pay you while you're here. It's not right that you shouldn't continue to my family, he says. It's not right that you shouldn't contribute. It's not right that you should contribute to my family and I not pay you anything. So he asks him to tell him what he thinks his wages should be. Let's negotiate for you month by month how much I should pay you. So now we're entering into the negotiation phase of the story, but they're not just going to negotiate his wages. Picking up the text in 29:16, it says, "Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful." Now, let me explain something to you at this time, folks. Laban had 2 daughters. Leah is the oldest, and she is the one who's said to have poor eyesight, which would have been a considerable disability in those times before glasses. Now, some commentators I've read literally tie themselves in knot, trying to explain exactly what this extra piece of information means. Some think this statement refers to just how the fact that she's unattractive, and meaning that she doesn't have a sparkle in her eyes, that there was not a lot of expression in her face. Now, I'm not sure about that, but however you explain it, the real point in these latter part of the verses is it's giving a description of Leah and it's contrasting it with that of Rachel. And of Rachel, the text says she was beautiful in form and appearance. The words that are used tell us that she has a beautiful face and an attractive physique. And then it goes on to tell us in verse 18, Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than any other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, my time is completed, and I want to make love to her." So it tells us that Jacob did indeed love Rachel. Now, he just met her at this point, and this may have been a day or 2 later, but this attraction was obviously intense and immediate. But do you catch the fact of what's going on here? Remember, who was the oldest? Leah. And remember, the elder daughter would normally be married first. But Jacob here wants the younger one, and he says he'll work 7 years if he gives her to him as his wife. Now, by the standards of that day, he's putting a very high price on her. 7 years' work was a much higher price than would normally be paid for a wife. But it says he's in love with her, and he's clearly willing to do that. And Laban, not surprisingly, says, "Okay," adding the caveat, "That's better anyway than I give her to some man as a wife, a man who's a stranger." Now, I would have thought 7 years felt like an eternity to a relatively young man, but it says here he'll do the 7 years and he'll give him his wife, and it seems to be okay with that. And then picking up the narrative in verse 22, it says, "So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant." This is interesting, isn't it? So they throw a party, a wedding party. All the locals, people gather, all the men come. And do you notice what goes on here? It says Laban takes his daughter and brings her to Jacob. And that means by that, Jacob would have been in the tent and he brings her into the tent. remember, who is Jacob in love with? That's right, Rachel, who was the wedding feast celebrating. Again, Rachel and Jacob. But who does he end up getting brought to his tent? Leah. Now let's keep reading. This really is an interesting part of the story. And it tells us, and Laban gave his servant Zilpah to be the daughter as her attendant. And when morning came, there was Leah. So there's an element of surprise in that concluding phrase of that verse 24. So how do you explain that? How do you explain what's going on here, that he wakes up with Leah? And this is where it gets to be a bit of fun, because when you read the commentaries, they go through all sorts of loops to try and explain what's going on here. Well, to do that justice, I think we'll look at that in the next episode. So we're at this point in the text in Genesis chapter 29, where Jacob has just woken up and found that Leah he spent the night with Leah in the tent after the wedding feast, rather than Rachel, whom he expected. So let me remind you of that closing verse, which said, and Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. So he's brought Leah in and moved by cover of darkness and put her in the tent with Jacob on the wedding night. And then that verse closes with it saying, when morning came, there was Leah. So how do we explain that? How do we explain what's going on here? And this is where it gets to be fun, if you like, because all the different commentaries have a different idea and a different way of trying to explain this. So we'll begin by doing that, by considering some of the perspectives here. So let me give you some of the possibilities as to what people think is going on. One is, most draw attention to the fact that it was dark, which is probably true, by the way. Some have suggested that Jacob ate so much food and maybe drink as well that he fell asleep when Leah arrived at his tent. Or some others have come up with a creative idea that Laban put Leah in Rachel's clothes and sprinkled her with his perfume. Well, there are a couple of ideas, but there's no direct evidence from the scripture to suggest that's the case, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. One commentator I read suggested that there are a number of factors may have contributed to Jacob's unawareness of his deception. He draws attention to the fact that there was no reason for suspicion. He said Jacob would have had no reason to think that something like this was going to happen. And remember, she would have been brought to him under cover of darkness. And the two sisters probably had a similar general physical resemblance and stature. Others have said the most obvious one, that Jacob was intoxicated from drinking so much at the feast, and that his mind was clouded. And other experts I've read, interestingly, say that she could very well have been veiled when she was brought to him. Now that's interesting, isn't it? And even today, I know someone from India who said their father, who was married in the 1960s, told him that when they got married, he didn't see his wife's face until 3 days after the wedding. And I have been told that it is still customary in some parts of India for the bride to remain veiled until after the completion of the marriage ceremony. And that's interesting that still happens today. But anyway, Jacob wakes up and there is Leah. Can you imagine what he was feeling when he found out that this trick had been played on him? He must have been furious. But we don't have to imagine how he felt. Verse 25 will tell us how he felt. So let's pick up the text there. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also, in return for another 7 years of work." So this is one of the major turning points of the story here. You deceived me, Jacob is saying to his father-in-law. Interesting to me that Jacob previously deceived his own father to get his blessing instead of his brother's, and this is a case of this deceiver being deceived in a similar way. it really appears to be the case of what goes around comes around, doesn't it? Well, we'll unpack that a little bit at the end. Jacob accuses Laban of deceiving him, and Laban says, well, it's not our custom to give the younger before the firstborn daughter is married. I did it because the oldest should be married first. And Jacob says, well, why didn't you tell me that 7 years ago instead of tricking me on my actual wedding night? You have deceived me, he says. But Laban then says, finish your final week, the wedding feast week for Leah, and then serve me for another 7 years for Rachel. You promised to work for me for 7 more years, and you can have Rachel as well, he says. So Jacob fulfills his wedding week, and then Laban gives his daughter Rachel as his wife also to Jacob, and they get married. But he has to spend 7 years now working for Laban to fulfill the contract he got because he got her ahead of time. And the text closes out this chapter by saying, and Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant, and Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. Now all this will become significant in the next 7 chapter, and maybe Jacob's going to have some payback time. There'll be again what goes around coming around for Jacob, because if you lie down with fleas, if you lie down with dogs, they say you get fleas, and these people are con men and tricksters tricking each other. But here is what's going on up to this point. The deceiver was deceived. Jacob had pretended to be the older brother 1 chapter ago, and now Leah here pretends to be the younger sister. Leah and her father deceived Jacob just in the same way, a very similar way to how Jacob and Rebekah had previously deceived his own father Isaac. Jacob had deceived Isaac by taking his advantage of his inability to see due to poor eyesight. And also Laban here takes advantage of Jacob by mainly by his inability to see who is brought into his tent in the dark. So Laban and Leah are being just as deceitful as Jacob had previously been. Now, one commentator says this is just about the meanest trick ever played. It's certainly one of the meanest tricks that we witness being played in the Bible. Okay, that's the end of chapter 29. Let me just sum up and let me make a few observations about what we've looked at these last couple of days. The sum of it is straightforward enough. The Lord led Jacob to his relatives in the east so that he could get away from his brother, who he felt in danger from, while at the same time the Lord, in doing that, allowed the deceiver to be deceived, maybe in order to teach him what deception felt like. So what I want to do is break this story down now and give you just some simple observations by way of conclusion. The first thing I believe we should take away from this message is the very simple, straightforward thing, is that God continues to bless his children. I mean, that's what's clearly going on here in spite of all the twists and turns. He promised he would give the land to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. How many times have we heard that phrase going out through the book? And that is remaining the case here. That's what's going on here. And the bottom line is in order for that to happen, God has to fulfill his promise, and Jacob has to get a wife. So in one sense, God is allowing the providing of a wife so that promise can be fulfilled. And what's fascinating to me is God is maintaining that end goal, if you like, that God is working through all these human deceptions in order to still get that done. And that tells me that no matter what people do, God is and will remain faithful to his promises and his plans, and even his promises to bless his children. Now, the second lesson I would take away from this is that yes, God blesses his children, but also God disciplines his children. You see, within the context of the book of Genesis, you cannot help but read this story without being struck by the fact that he had just deceived his father. One of the commentaries I read said Jacob was getting exactly what he deserved. He had to work for 7 extra years as a payment for what should have been his by ordinary and fair means. The writer begins to draw an important lesson from these narratives for us. Jacob, deceptive schemes, his way of obtaining his blessing, clearly does not meet with divine approval. Though through Jacob's plans and machinations, God's will, it will still be accomplished, friends. And the writer of the Genesis text is intent on pointing out as well that the schemes and the tricks and the machinations were not God's divine plan. The Bible makes that statement over and over again, not just here but elsewhere. Proverbs 11, Proverbs 22, Hosea 8:10 and chapters 11 all show stories and human plots and schemes, but yet still being used by God to bring about his purposes. You see, what Jacob did to Esau, his brother, and his father was underhanded, despicable, and mean. And what Laban does here is also underhanded, despicable, and mean. So in other words, on this occasion, what goes around comes around. So it should be noted that that's the principle. But while it's a principle that is often true, it is not always the case. It is true in this case. It may be true for us in situations we find ourselves in, but it is not absolutely or necessarily true in every case. In other words, there are exceptions to this rule. Some people will not get caught in this life for the wrong that they do, but they will have to face the judgment but they will have to face the judge of all the earth in the next life. So the important point is God blesses his children, but God also disciplines his children. Maybe I should rephrase that by saying God sometimes teaches us, sometimes teaches his children through discipline. Have you ever thought about it that way? At Bethel in the previous chapter, Jacob wrestled with the Lord and he learned some things about God. But now he's in Haran and he's learned some things about his own wicked heart, his own sinful nature, or at least we hope he has. So God, we see here, is in the business of teaching his children about himself and about themselves. But what is fascinating is this, and what I'm about to say I think is often misunderstood by many Christians, but it's important. I said God can bless his children and God disciplines his children, right? But I need to add to that sometimes God does both these things at the same time, and I believe that's what the story is teaching us. It's not a binary either or situation. We tend to think, I believe, that God either blesses us or disciplines us. The truth is, he may be in the process of blessing us sometimes through discipline. So I want to say God will always remain faithful to his promises, friends. The promise to bless his people, the promise to bless you, his child. But in the process of that blessing, he may very well be disciplining you also. Sometimes bringing to bear the consequences of what you've done or previously unresolved sin in your life. I know we often tend, to think in black and white, when in reality, all of these things can sometimes overlap or even happen at the same time. I think the great illustration of this, the big illustration of this on the macro scale, is what happened to the children of Israel after they refused to go into the land of Kadesh Barnea. God says, you wouldn't go into this land. I told you to go in. So instead, you're now going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. That was the discipline that he put on the children of Israel to teach them to obey. So in the meantime, they wandered round, but during that time, that 40 years, he still continued to feed them supernaturally and to bless them also. So sometimes God blesses his children and disciplines them at the same time. Sometimes he will bless us and discipline us at the same time. All these observations I've made are in this passage, and they're really worth noting. But the individual lesson here for Jacob, I believe, is one where he's trying to say, look out, for the deceiver can get deceived. Therefore, take note, friends, and be careful what you do, because your actions can be like a boomerang and they can come back to you. The cheater can often get cheated, the liar will often get lied to, and the thief will get robbed. And here the deceiver got deceived. Sometimes those who live by the sword will indeed die by the sword, and for them what goes around comes around. That is often the principle, but it's not necessarily the rule. So I did think about how I could illustrate this at the end, because you know I love to illustrate my teaching with a story. But you know, the story in the book of Genesis sends this message in its own right. But there is another example I'd like to end with. I'm sure many of you have heard the story of Aesop. Now, in fact, he lived 600 years before Christ, after this was written, but before the arrival of Christ. But he was very famous for creating moral stories, what we today call Aesop's fables. And he tells the story of the fox, the donkey, and the lion. And as he tells that story, it talks about the donkey and the fox entering into a partnership together for their mutual protection, and they went out in the forest to try and find food together. But they'd not proceeded very far when they came upon a lion. Now the fox recognized the immediate danger and approached the lion, and I think Aesop says whispered in his ears and promised to contrive to help the lion catch the donkey if the lion would promise not to harm him. He said, I can fix it for you that you can catch the donkey without having to stalk him, and if I do that for you, can I go free? And the lion said yes. So the fox then goes back to the donkey and says, come on, let's go. But he leads him to somewhere where he knew someone had dug a trap, and he led him in such a way that he fixed it that the donkey falls into the big hole in the ground, falls into the trap. Then the fox goes to the lion and says, deal's done, my friend. The donkey is trapped for you to eat whenever you want. The lion then looked in the hole, sees the donkey, and says, and he says, yeah, donkey's trapped, can't get out of the hole. So the lion eats the fox right away and says to him just before he eats him, I'm eating you, but I can now eat the donkey later at my leisure. So there's an example of a trickster being tricked, being trapped by his own treachery. And that's one way to illustrate this story. But you know, at the end of the day, this story in its own right here in the book of Genesis, sends its message in its own way better than any other illustration I can find. Here we see the con man getting conned, the trickster getting tricked, the deceiver falling to deception. So the message for us, friends, is be careful what we do. Be careful how we live our lives, because what goes around may indeed for us come around. And God might in fact choose to teach us and to discipline us in order that he can bless us in the future. But finally, I'd just like to say thank you again. You know, I really couldn't do this without you. With the knowledge of this wonderful community of people doing this together, I couldn't do it without your help and particularly your prayerful encouragement. But that's it for today. I do hope I'll see you right back here again very soon. It'll be for tomorrow for me, I'll be doing another, but whatever day it happens to be for you, you access it. I hope you are blessed by it, and I'll see you again very soon on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.